James Sommerville is the co-founder of design agency Attic. Over 25 years, their work and collection of experimental design books demonstrated diversity and collaboration. After Attic was acquired by Dentsu, James joined the Coca-Cola company in 2013. There he designed global brand activations, including the One Brand strategy and the Taste the Feeling campaign. Under his leadership, Coke reestablished itself as a cultural leader through bold and iconic design. James departed the corporate world in 2018 to start the next revolution in the creative agency world, centered around a 100% distributed talent model of known brands and unknown creative talent who are invited to respond to global brand challenges. So with that, I will turn it over to James Sommerville.
I'm just off to visit a character we set up in business, gosh, 20 years ago now, I think. And it's called Attic. And one of the co-founders set it up in the attic belonging to his grandmother. And now it's become a multinational design company with offices in San Francisco, New York, and in London. And they're turning over £10 million a year. And when you think about it, it's not bad for a £1,000 grant from the start.
Punk lives on in Huddersfield.
There's nothing like you can do about it.
Hey everybody, this is James. Thank you for the introduction, Alice, and thank you to Monotype for the invite. I get the feeling that many of us on this call have a similar background. That was my life in a nutshell. I'd like to unpack a few things, but so I feel like I'm amongst people, like-minded people, so that makes me feel comfortable, so thank you for that. I'd like to maybe, you know, when I was young and trying to learn the craft of design, I wanted to learn how to design naturally from art school, but I've learned over these years also that it's also about survival as a designer and in a broader sense as well. There's 5 words that have stuck with me, and indeed I've gone looking for them, but they're very relevant today. But I've seen this, and it's been part of my career over 35 years. So I'd like to touch on a few of these things, and maybe, you know, 1 or 2 things you may be able to relate to as well. So the first one, in terms of change, change started to happen in my family, in my life, actually before I was born. So on the 7th of February 1964, I wasn't around yet, but, you know, maybe it's changed for my parents, but a flight came from London to JFK. And that was the day the Beatles arrived with all this kind of screaming fans, and we've all seen the black and white footage. And so there's nothing so significant about that for me, except for this gentleman on the left. He was my uncle. So I kind of like, as a young boy and you know, 8, 9, 10, I heard stories, and he used to tell me, you know, kind of some of the things that maybe didn't always make it out into the media because he followed them around the US. He was their press officer. But in terms of change, what was fascinating to me, even as a 10-year-old, is this identity change. So music aside, which will live on forever, no doubt, the way that their brand identity, they have a band and a brand, and just that kind of ability, even back then, to be able to kind of change with and stay relevant. So for me, that was something that that I found very powerful at the time. The second kind of point is this uncertainty, and there's uncertainty everywhere right now. And if I look back to my pre-teens and teenage years, growing up in the UK at that point was a very uncertain time. But I think it also fueled creativity. So my small town, and I noticed there was someone on from Leeds today, but I'm next door in a small town called Huddersfield in Yorkshire, in England, in the north of England. And so it was once a mini Silicon Valley for textiles. It was in the heart of the Industrial Revolution, and it was booming. Of course, 100 years ago, it was booming. When I grew up, those mills and that textile background, the mills are still there, but they kind of look like this. This is my playground. This is as a boy and as a teenager hanging out in these spaces that really are just kind of all life had been sucked out of them. And indeed, they just became very dark places. So as a teenager or as an early young boy, I felt before technology had even arrived, and I thought the game was over. I thought before my careers even started, like, this place is a dark place. But then there was a shining light for me, and the summer of 1977 was again musically influenced. The explosion of punk rock, specifically in the UK, and the way that influenced me as a not quite a designer, but someone who was interested in art. The way that they express themselves through fashion, through music, of course, through their lyrics, but visually, it was starting to speak to me in a way that I would not know how that might unfold. But just those early, kind of uncertain at that point, but then seeing some of the great album work from designers who I worship today, and seeing some of that from very hand-drawn and lo-fi to very simplistic and minimal, even in that early part of my career. Now, you know, I needed some help. I looked like this, so there's no way I was going to get hired as a designer. I'm the one on the right, and the other guy on the left became my business partner. We were street artists, chalking on the streets of the UK for 5 years as teens, just to kind of create some income, but more than anything to kind of get out and see the real world. It was never going to last forever. There's a charity, and maybe on the film you recognize His Royal Highness Prince Charles has a charity for young people. He helped Attic. He invested £2,000, and then we created our agency model, founded in my grandmother's attic bedroom. And this is the first studio. This is the first attic. This is actually after we decorated. So, but humble beginnings. But for us, we were thrust into this world of an emerging technology. I fast forwarded a few years now to the mid-90s, where maybe Photoshop was on the third or fourth iteration, and Macs were becoming a little bit more powerful. So we exploded with all this kind of like, almost like a 90s equivalent of that punk rock expression, much more digital, heavily layered, very complex when we look back now, you know, and just essentially throwing graphical, typographical, you know, layers into it, just to really push ourselves. But what we were also doing at the same time is connecting with others. These books that we created back then, which are pages and pages of print, obviously pre-digital, enabled us to make connections with great designers coming through, young designers. We were young designers then, but designers that really we could actually kind of collaborate with. So this theme of collaboration was very much part of our early roots as a design agency. And whilst the graphic work has become somewhat tired and out of date, the process of building these design books was for us a great way to publicize our fledgling agency, but at the same time, a great way to connect with a community. And we ended up with these kind of huge storybooks of graphic executions and experiments. This is, in many ways, our Instagram feed of the 90s. So that over 6 years, we realized we had over 120 designers who had contributed from 7 countries. Back then, we weren't moving around as much, but we produced 5 books. And for us, that was a really great way for us to kind of like publicize our work and our entity, our studio, but importantly, to connect with the community. I didn't understand the power of that back then, but it's something that became a pattern. We worked with real clients. Scion, with my partners, and the Attic studio in San Francisco helped launch Scion for Toyota back in around about 2002. And then I received a call. I was in the UK then. I received a call from Coca-Cola, and I jump forward now to 2006. And this was a really interesting project. I did not do this work. This was the work for the World Cup 2006 that was in Germany. And this was Coke's campaign on 3 pieces, 3 touch points. So not the whole campaign, but certainly to give you a sense of, it almost looked like that heavily layered, heavily photoshopped, kind of lots of textures and scratches and, you know, some guy holding a chicken and lots of things going on. So they asked us, could we create a piece of packaging that would really reflect Coke's commitment to football, to soccer? So we did our best, and we created this is my first ever Coca-Cola project. And the simplicity of actually shunning all those layers and turning our back on that kind of very heavily kind of kind of complex work to something very simple. The soccer ball pattern, the hexagon pattern, and the Coke bottle, and of course, as you can see, can be recolored around the world. So for me, that was the start of thinking much more about kind of brand execution versus experimentation. But we always had a mindset of bringing that together. Fast forward a few years, and Attic was a fantastic journey. We were a small agency, and I felt it was important to go and find a large entity. I didn't know where. I knew that I didn't have that experience. I had 0 commercial experience, so I was definitely going to have to fake it to a degree. But at the same time, I guess with that notion of seeking change and looking for uncertainty, I thought to myself, well, why not? Why not just kind of like, go for it and see whether I can find someone who would. So I did receive the call off Coke after Attic had been acquired. And it was an exciting time. I went from this very tiny agency model to this kind of super tanker of a brand. And I was always on the outside looking in, like most of us. But what attracted me really was some of the kind of crafted moments in Coke's heritage. I was obsessed by the script. Who designed that? What was the evolution of that? And we know it stood the test of time. And I thought it was the founder, whose name was John Pemberton from Atlanta, Georgia, where I am today. Actually, it was another gentleman. It was actually the company accountant who designed the Coca-Cola script, Frank Robinson. If you look at his cursive script below, it's got a fantastic flow to it. But to think that one of the most famous icons or logos in the world was designed by an accountant means that there's definitely hope for me and anyone walking into this large organization. So that openness was great, and the story of Coca-Cola was very thrilling for me. Like Steve Jobs in a garage, it was John Pemberton in his house. He popped up in a pharmacy, and he created prototypes around packaging. This is way before the Coca-Cola bottle of today. In many ways, it was like an early iteration. It was like your first generation bottle, iPod, however we see it, but it was always about progress. And then in 1915, Coke sent a brief out to their bottling network that was growing and saying, we need a proprietary bottle. This was the winning pitch, the winning sketch by a Indiana root bottling company. And I think a couple of guys, I don't know the story too well, but I know that a couple of guys sketched this in the library. And this essentially won the pitch, and the rest, as they say, would be history. So for me, it was kind of like a thrill to join an entity like this, to take my naive, entrepreneurial kind of mindset and bring that to this. And with that great legacy and brand strength and that fantastic culture, I wondered how I could fit in. The one thing I did realize arriving is I felt that Coke had been stuck in a repetitive kind of mode. Many brands get there as well, just organically or through, it's difficult to introduce change. And I look back through some of their work and I was like, oh, wow, this felt like our 90s Photoshop books. There's like layers on layers and layers. There's, and hundreds of agencies and lots of people in different markets doing different things, from shopper all the way through to kind of like tier one communication. And I thought, maybe this is the space to try and clean up the house. I was obsessed with the archives at Coke, and look at this great, this fantastic art direction from the 70s, the pop of red, the storytelling with the cat, just the kind of like the composition, it's all there. And so for me, I took my inspiration when I arrived at Coke from the past, and I still believe with a lot of brands, they've just got such these rich heritage. Raquel Welch here, almost sporting an Apple or an Apple Watch or an iPhone hanging from her belt there, way beyond its kind of time in 1970. And then some previous advertising work, from great art directors who had worked on the brand, or artists, both musically and literal artists. And these have become kind of like the famous pieces of Coke. But I felt that it was all centered around the Coca-Cola bottle and the magic of that shape that was that sketch in 1915. Surely there's potentially a new way in which the bottle could be represented. So one of the first tasks, and looking at this bottle here is quite interesting, the kind of bubbles and the kind of condensation, was to see whether there was a new way of presenting something that was almost 100 years old at that point in 1915. So this was like 2014. And then looking at different components, parts. No one ever really shoots the almost empty package, the almost empty toothpaste tube, or in this case, Coke bottle, because that's kind of when it's not as magical. But for me, it's still that magical last sip, or the empty bottle. And actually, somebody once said, there's only one thing better than a Coke bottle, that's an empty Coke bottle. That's assuming someone's enjoyed it and someone's shared it, and therefore that experience has been transferred. So I was really looking at ways in which the Coca-Cola bottle could become really kind of like this beacon that we could design around again. Not always in glass, not always in aluminium, even though the alu bottle is still there today. But seeing that as almost like a vehicle, like shooting a high-end kind of piece of engineering in many ways. And then I stumbled across this painting in the archives. 1950, it was painted for an advertisement in Brazil, if anyone's on from Brazil. This is a gemstone, I think, and the lady in red, as you can see by the jet black hair and the focal point of her bright red lips. And I gave this to the design team at Coca-Cola, of which I was still kind of building and re-engineering, and said, how would you recreate the lady in red? So the team sort of set about just kind of recreating different versions of her, some closer in, some slightly more abstract, and becoming a little more pop art, or in many ways, further out, losing that recognition of the original. But they're all interpretations of that kind of classic 1950s canvas. And what that said to me is, and at this point we were on the verge of the centenary of the Coca-Cola bottle, that maybe in terms of collaborating with designers around the world, we could find a way to connect. I found a little moment, an Easter egg moment in the Coca-Cola bottle when there's a certain crop, you'll find the number 100. So it felt like, you know, this is a great opportunity. It's not going to come around again for another 100 years. So the notion was really to invite 100 designers, give them 100 days approximately. And if we could kind of create 100 posters to celebrate the 100 years of the Coca-Cola bottle, that means that all these kind of great marketing from the past 50, 60, 70, 80 years, the way before, obviously, my time and anybody's time, maybe on this call, that really, how could we reinterpret this? So we gave these to the designers, the 100 designers, in the same way that we gave the lady in red. Said, what would you do? Pick one, and how would you recreate that? And then whether they're freelancers, designers in agencies, and these are all interpretations now of some of the artwork that came back in 2015. Which was that kind of centenary year for the Coca-Cola bottle. So rather than 100 years old, really you're trying to kind of express the Coke bottle as relevant, still part of popular culture in that sense, being seen through the eyes of new designers, and 100 years young versus 100 years old. And it's still the same shape, and it's still born from that first sketch. Whether it's graphic or has a level of humanity or just kind of more pattern-based or photographic and graphic, kind of like you almost kind of derobing the glass to get to the icon itself. Some of them not in this deck, but some of them animated and therefore created patterns and textures. So this work was really celebrated several years ago now, but for me, it was this notion of taking that one single focal point. Of course, there's a thread, there's a red thread through the color palette, but just the number of expressions that designers around the world could bring to a single shape and a single form, seeing levels of storytelling or humanity or graphic patterns and so on. Multiplying it, showing that kind of diversity or that range and that scale. And for us, it was a really fantastic way to engage with designers around the world for execution, but also then to kind of like rally. And I think the next speakers might be also speaking to you about internal. This is very much an internal kind of execution at that point to bring a little bit of pride back to the culture of Coke. Here's a little film that lasts about a minute, but hopefully it plays and it doesn't lag and the audio. So I'll let you, this kind of summarizes that project.
Know who you are, brighter than the brightest star. Heaven to my fingertips. Baby, you're the greatest I've ever kissed. Nobody, you. The way you walk, the way you talk, the way you move. There is nobody like you. Nobody, you. You walk the way you talk, the way you move. There is nobody like nobody like you.
So that was a fun project, but it was experimental. It was internal. It wasn't a main thrust campaign. It wasn't built into the kind of annual business plans. But it really was starting to prove. So the next project that came along was the one brand strategy, and we did some experiments, early experiments, and these have never seen any daylight. This is really very much behind the scenes. And could we kind of use the script in a new way? At that point, all the cans and all the packaging had their own individual color. You might remember zero used to be in black. And there was a kind of a discussion around really the equity of the red was diminishing. And 10 years from now, it'll get smaller and smaller on the beverage aisle as new colas and new Cokes come out. So actually, what about bringing the red back to, and we needed a vehicle of which to do that. I went to the archives and the famous red disc of Coca-Cola was originally designed in the 50s to say, even at this mom and pop or this pizza stand, this is where you'll buy the original, the real thing. So by using that as the starting point and placing that in the context of, and allowing it to grow over time, and over time means over 5 years, it would mean that, for over a 5-year period, we can, and if anyone is a Coke Zero drinker, they'll remember the can on the left. But actually, how do you move it to the one on the right? And this evolution, as we call this kind of rising disc, would allow us to kind of navigate that packaging over time to be eventually full red. Still zero sugar, but it's actually regained its equity instead of giving away the equity and that runs across every packaging as well. So that was a very exciting project. The next one, and it kind of comes into the faking it a little bit as well, because I'd never really shot anything on a global scale. I was looking at the photographic content from shopper marketing, a different agency for out of home, and then licensing. There's kind of couture, kind of, catwalk, and everything had a slightly different kind of look and feel. And I didn't see why it necessarily needed to in a one brand strategy. So again, my archive visit, these kind of wonderful paintings, this kind of storytelling of how those artists and art directors back then and the photography from the 60s. And I thought to myself, what would this girl look like today? I love the fact that she was kind of couldn't choose between the two guys, and a left and right hand are kind of crossing there, and it's Coke at the heart of it. But what does she look like today or tomorrow? Well, so we started to kind of experiment and start to see whether we could take some of that vintage classic storytelling, and those moments really don't change, but the context does, the country does, the drinks have changed, the beverages changes, but a girl on a beach hanging out and a friend approaching, it happens every day. So how do we kind of take those, whether they're hand painted or art directed from a certain period, and see whether we can recreate those? This great Valentine piece, probably from the early 60s or late 50s, and how that looks today, still coming together side by side over a Coca-Cola. So for us, this was just an early experiment of taking what was always great about the brand, but actually reinterpreting it in a way that would feel very, very relevant. I started to think about some of the artists, and I'm a big Norman Rockwell fan. I mean, his work speaks for itself, but it's the storytelling. And I thought, what if he had Instagram? Who'd be following him? I would, for sure. But what would his feed look like? How do you bring that kind of storytelling in a Rockwell that's got all these different moments in all four corners of his work, but instantaneously, with authenticity, but immediately shot? So we start to shoot these kind of stories that started to be inspired by those artists, but at the same time feel immediate and not over styled, not over labored, and shooting in a way that actually was more emotional. And this was for the World Cup a couple of years ago. But this idea of it kind of getting back to that authenticity of the brand itself and being more playful, and sometimes not even showing the product, but it's just kind of suggestive, and we will see this product maybe 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 times a day, depending on what street we may be on. So why always show it? And if we do show it, is there a new way in which we could celebrate the consumption, if we want to call it, or celebrate where we would hang out and lie down and sunbathe and kind of see, sometimes we're on the beach and sometimes we're on Tar Beach. So just this notion of recreating, and then our kind of graphic work from our poster exercise was starting to influence our photography. So this mashing together of graphic and photographic, and you recognize a couple of these, starts to kind of influence the storytelling and the humanity, both sides, whether it's graphic humanity or literally photographic. So that was another kind of fake it to sort of make it. But other things that I think, you know, I'm inspired by when I see, you know, whether it's black market T-shirts or, you know, copycat collars, for me, those are very inspirational. They're not part of the company. They're not part of, and it's a compliment, of course, but the company had never used its script other than, so these are all copycat T-shirts, as we might imagine. But there was an opportunity for the Australia business unit for us to create a piece of packaging that said the word love. They submitted this for global approval. And it's kind of, you know, it's okay. It's in the Share a Coke style. That you may have seen your names and things like that, but we just felt it was a golden opportunity to use the Coca-Cola script in a way. We had 11 days to figure it out and to be in market, because it was very much a reactive, supportive campaign. So we sketched this out and then vectored it the same day, and 11 days later, it was on pack. So to actually kind of like devote its core packaging, its premium packaging to a new word that does not say Coca-Cola, but using the assets of that. So packaging plays a huge role. And part of that was to continue that legacy that had already started. And what does that line look like in the future? How does Coca-Cola maintain that journey of surprise and delight while still kind of feeling recognizable? The next piece of packaging, this one always stuck in my mind, this reference that was given to me in 2006. What I liked about it was the kind of sphere feel, and we were approached by Star Wars to create a unique piece of packaging and script for the new Star Wars experience in Disneyland. So, and Disney World. So our first, it was a mashup of Star Wars typography and the Coca-Cola script. So if you don't blink, because there's very subtle changes between these, you know, bringing some of the elements in. Does this work with a longer tail? Should we take some elements out? And like everything, you've got to kind of go all the way out there and start to kind of like, and then we kind of landed on this as the final. We brought the actual sweep or the curl back of the sea, because it's such a recognizable element. But you can see the mashup there, and if you are at Disneyland anytime soon or Disney World, you might see these. And just this idea of Coke being brave enough to kind of allow that script to be embedded or kind of brought together, but without actually making more noise. So a level of sort of disruption. I found that most of my career I've been, you know, looking at brands as a garden, and quite often an overgrown garden, just organically over time. It's just become overgrown. It's just become kind of like maybe not as sweet and delightful as it used to be. And actually by doing some replanting, some weeding, some cleaning up, it can still be rich. It can still be textured, but it can be a beautiful place to live. Or sit and gaze. And so really, I think the job of a designer in that sense is, yes, we can create some disruption within organizations, but it's also kind of a cleaning up exercise and reminding them of the genius that they were 100 years ago, or 50 years ago, or 25 years ago, because quite often they forget. I think on that level, and into sort of the fourth word of disrupting the model, the agency model. Not that things are changing all the time, but 2 years ago, I wanted to, I said thank you to Coke, and I felt it was time to move on and into the unknown. And I thought there was an opportunity then to really start to formalize this community-based collaboration. So I kind of created a little project around, you know, known brands and unknown talents, unrecognized talents, and seeing what that space would be in between and whether they could live in between. I felt over my career, I'd met some fantastic agencies, some amazing individuals, typographers, vector designers, logo designers, branding, packaging, animators, so on, and all that kind of community of work. so in 2018. And then I started to receive a couple of incoming calls from great brands who were looking to potentially, you know, refresh, revitalize, or just kind of rediscover themselves. HP needs no introduction, and the idea was to find a group of designers from different markets around the world, different cultures, give them a short period of time, and look for some kind of digital posts. And this is just, I'll go very quickly through this because each one of these needs to be introduced individually. But certainly for me, it was a way to kind of like really kind of see how the brand could manifest in terms of its products, printing, and obviously PCs and laptops and desktops, but also this notion of kind of rediscovering itself through this level of humanity. Technology is one thing, but in the hands of humanity, it only works. So it was a great way to kind of like engage with a global brand, but using this philosophy of community-based design. The next one that came along really was on a completely opposite kind of creative curve was Pringles. And Pringles wanted to connect with the gaming community. They wanted the gamer to be gaming and probably enjoying a Coke or a Monster and enjoying a snack. And that snack, they wanted it to be Mr. P and Pringles. So again, how do we bring Mr. P into a new world? This occasion, you know, 10 designers, 5 countries, 85 renders over the course of a month, and really exploring. So what would Mr. P look like if he was a gamer? If we could kind of move him from that more traditional, iconic, whether it's his bow tie, whether he's actually wearing the headsets, whether he's 8-bit, and so on, and really just be allowed to experiment, showing him as still recognizable, but with a slight twist to appeal to this kind of this new audience, and whether some of those kind of characters. And none of these were commercialized. We're all based on just sprints and concepts, but ways in which the actual kind of the gaming community could potentially see. And then eventually, of course, it turns into kind of a system and turns into kind of like from product to packaging to system thinking. So at the end, the longer tail of these exercises is always some level of system thinking. Recently been very honored to work on another iconic brand, the inventor of the granola bar, and a very strong, powerful brand at retail. And in many of our lives, we've grown up with this. So what does that look like in the future? How do we take the essence, the ingredients, excuse that pun, but the ingredients of Nature Valley, of the sun rising and the valley and that kind of morning daybreak, and actually transcend that into a graphic language that could inspire some executions beyond traditional communication, more design language led than campaign led. And for us, it was a way to just kind of like reignite an iconic brand and show them how amazing graphically and visually those are. So then again, yes, it eventually moves into some sort of level of experiment, and there's a whole system behind this that I don't have time to go into either. But and then most recently, very proud to be working with Ford Motor Company and the work that they've been doing recently. We did a very quick poster sprint with designers from around the world. Probably like 35 designers involved in this one, and one of the marks that they published on social media this week, and the work that they've been doing for the heroes is really during COVID is really just this little twist, just this little wink again, and seeing how a brand like that could actually kind of step up with action. That's the difference. They introduce that after the action. So to close out, I with this community of designers, and we don't, unfortunately, cannot make face masks and ventilators, but we are a community that can create storytelling and design messages and all these kind of very familiar messages now that we've been used to over the last 2 or 3 months. Was really just an exercise in seeing how a designer, illustrator, photographer, street artist, vector, hand-drawn, you know, and really kind of seen in different interpretations of the same message. Stay home, wash your hands, stay 6 feet apart, the usual things that we're all so used to seeing. But maybe if it was redesigned each time, it would just act as that kind of daily reminder. We were hoping at the time to have, you know, maybe 100 of these submitted on our kind of known unknown Instagram. And that 100 eventually turned into 1,000. So the community at large reacted in a way that we did not expect. And of course, you know, time has moved on, and 6 weeks feels like a decade right now. But, you know, in the early part of COVID, this was really a way for us to kind of express how designers were feeling, and the way that we could remind our neighbors, our friends, our mum and dads and family of the importance of that. So, you know, over 300, I'd say, creatives of all disciplines from 20 countries, maybe over the last kind of couple of months, and 1,000+ hashtags out there. So for us, kind of that spirit of collaborating from my very early days of Attic, being that street artist, you know, which I remember fondly, but it was all about engaging with people to see whether they could actually kind of build and create a network of designers. And here we are now, we're all somewhat remotely networked. On that, I still love a little bit of street art. With my 6-year-old, only a couple of days ago, and I still love Disney. So not necessarily Star Wars, the real Disney. So just having that passion to be able to almost draw characters at large scale takes me back 35 years from the very beginning, but still a little fun. So I'm going to wrap by saying, you know, we're not together in the same room. I do believe that when, you know, opposites do come together, as we did this little graphic a couple of years ago at Coke, then magic and something special can be seen in between. And I truly believe that more than ever today. So thank you to everybody for listening, watching, and Zooming. And of course, thank you to Monotype and the Monotype team for the invitation today. Happy to move into questions. You can find me out there if you'd like to continue the discussion on any of the work, and hand back to Alice and the team to maybe take it from there.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, James. That was a really inspiring talk. And I think, as I said to you earlier, seeing your driveway art is really inspiring. I've also tried to do the same with my family at home. It hasn't quite turned out as beautiful, but it's still been fun. So we're looking for some questions coming in. So I just want to remind everyone that just to go into the chat window, and we'll be happy to get to as many as we can in the next 10 minutes or so. So just to start things off, James, a couple things that have come up. One is around, you talked about brands eventually becoming an overgrown garden, potentially, and how should brands recognize when they've reached that point? What are the telltale signs that you would identify?
I think great question. I think we could do our usual. I'm just going to play a few Coke things in the background because it's like, you know. So yeah, I think taking an outside perspective. Sometimes we're all in routines and we use our tried and trusted partners, and that's great, that's healthy, and that brings growth for everybody. But I think sometimes kind of stepping outside of that circle and saying, hey, what do you think? Where do you think we are right now, and do you have an opinion? Now that could be a visual opinion, a strategic, or something, but I think sometimes a fresh pair of eyes can, as you've seen with this, I've never shot anything in my life for certainly on this scale. And then this was activated in 200 markets. So actually having the naivety of being an outsider can actually add very strong strategic value and creative output. So I would say step outside of the normal channels.
Great. So we have a few other questions coming in. This one is from Michael, asking, how important do you think it is for brands to be thinking about updating their brand identity, given the fast-changing world that we're living in today?
Good question, Michael. Thank you. I think it should be updated almost every day. I think gone are the days when I guess the logo and consistency and, you know, kind of like it just becomes a sticker. I think Google have shown us, before that MTV showed us. I think those are brands that feel alive. From the Coca-Cola work, it doesn't dilute the brand to do that. I think it shows confidence. If the question means a more formal update, a more kind of let's call it like a redesign, I think that would be depending on the equity within it, whether it's a kind of careful redesign. We watched the work this morning from Santander Bank in Spain. It was a very gentle update, but it was just enough. So I think there are degrees of change. Social media allows the brand to speak in a very creative way every day. And nobody really honestly wants to stare at someone's logo every day. They want to see the personality behind the brand. And I think that's the opportunity that we have today with technology.
So a couple questions coming in from Chris. First asking, he's always been curious, what was the size of your creative team at Coke? And also as a follow-on, who shot all this beautiful photography that you've shared?
The team was pretty small. The global team was like 20. And then we had probably a similar size in the North American business unit, and then maybe another 15 scattered around the world. So you kind of talking somewhere between 50 and 60 in total. I mean, you know, that was a discussion I had every day. I used to, you know, think that maybe a brand that size, but you know, it was a great team within, and that forced collaboration. So, you know, what is the big question? Do you go out of the house and hire agencies? Do you build an in-house team? I think what we defaulted to was a hybrid of internal designers, but relying on external. And the work that you're looking at was shot by Guy Arop and Anna Palmer. We intentionally selected them because they were fashion photographers. They'd never shot beverage, and that was great. And we're really looking for those real moments. So they're both based in New York.
Fantastic. So another question is coming from Stan, asking, how have you found that these massive brands are comfortable with the creative sprints that you described? Does it excite them or overwhelm them? I can see both happening.
Yeah, actually, before I should credit this to Nacho Risi in Argentina. So he also shot some of this for down there. So I think brands with great heritage who are looking to rediscover that spark that made them so great, especially in such a fast-moving world now, where growth is the #1 name above the door next to the logo. I think it excites them. I think it's not just about something external as well. I think it culturally, it drives culture. It makes people feel proud again. And I think that rediscovery, we've all been in situations where we've rediscovered. I was chalking on the pavement last week after 35 years, earlier this week, and I rediscovered I could do it. And so that brands rediscovering that narrative, that design language, that strength that they've always had, but just maybe over time, it's back to the garden. So in many cases, global brands really enjoy that playback to themselves and seeing the potential that they could move forward with over the next 5 years, maybe the next decade. You know, it kind of sparks that culture again.
That's great. And probably gives a more human connection to the brands too, I would imagine. So I think we have time for one more question. This one comes from Erica. How do you incorporate experience brand language into your approach to brand design, going beyond the visual elements and more so the experience the user may go through when experiencing different brands, for example, smell and sound?
Yeah, I mean, obviously in a Zoom kind of context like this, there's only so much, and it's 99% visual. I think, of course, you know, brands of tomorrow, as we all know, we're all professionals. We know that it's more about the experience than the ad or the photo. However interesting a photo may be, or a logo, or a color palette, really it's the holistic. It's all of the above. And so it's walking in somewhere. You're a consumer, Erica and everybody else. We probably give it 5 seconds before we really kind of feel, well, are we going to stay a little bit longer? Whether that's staying on a site or staying in a physical brick and mortar. So I think it is absolutely everything, and my deck today is centered mostly on the visual, but it is a kind of more sensorial 360 opportunity more than anything. It's a great way for brands to rethink it in the future as well.